It was Christmas Eve, and the snowstorm outside was relentless. My family and I were holed up in our cabin in the woods, miles away from the nearest neighbor. The plan was to spend a quiet holiday away from the chaos of the city, but the isolation suddenly felt suffocating as the wind howled and the temperature dropped. Around 9 p.m., as we were finishing up dinner, the lights flickered and went out. It wasn't surprising given the storm, but what was surprising was the faint knocking we heard at the front door. My dad hesitated, then grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the sound. "Who could be out in this weather?" my mom whispered. We followed him, curious but uneasy. He opened the door just a crack. Standing there, illuminated by the flashlight beam, was a man. He wasn't dressed for the cold, just a thin hoodie and jeans. His face was pale, his lips blue, and his eyes were vacant. "Please, can I come in?" he stammered. "I'm lost." My dad, ever cautious, asked the man where he was coming from, but his answers didn't make sense. He claimed he'd been walking for hours, but his clothes were bone dry. And then there was his smile, forced, almost too wide, like he was trying to sell us on something he didn't believe himself. My mom pulled my dad back and insisted we couldn't let him in. "We can't risk it," she said. "What if he's dangerous?" The man must have heard because his expression shifted in an instant. His smile disappeared, replaced by something darker. Without another word, he turned and walked away into the snow, vanishing into the darkness. We locked the door and double-checked every window. But later that night, as we were trying to sleep, we heard it again. A soft knocking. This time at the window. I peered through the curtains and froze. There he was, standing just inches from the glass, his face pale and twisted into that same unsettling smile. But now, there was something behind him. A shadowy figure, taller and much darker, loomed over him, its hand resting on his shoulder. And then, they were both gone. 2 years ago, my grandmother gave me a strange Christmas ornament. It was an antique glass bauble with a painted face, grinning like an old-timey doll. She said it had been passed down through generations of our family, though no one else seemed to know about it. Something about it unsettled me. Its eyes were painted too realistically, almost like they were watching. That year, I decided to hang it near the back of the tree where it wouldn't draw too much attention. But every time I walked past the tree, I swore I saw the face shifting slightly. The grin seemed wider, the eyes following me. I'd brush it off as my imagination, but the feeling stuck with me. On Christmas Eve, I woke up to the sound of something shattering in the living room. My first thought was the cat had knocked something over, but as I sat up in bed, I realized the house was eerily quiet. No scampering paws, just silence. Heart pounding, I grabbed my phone for light and crept down the hallway. The tree stood in the corner of the living room, dark and ominous with its lights unplugged. Glass shards littered the floor beneath it. My gaze fell on the ornament. It was lying in pieces in the middle of the room, shattered beyond repair. Relief washed over me. Maybe now the weird feeling would go away. As I turned to head back to bed, I froze. There, on the mantel, was the ornament, perfectly intact. My breath caught in my throat. The shattered pieces were still on the floor, but somehow the bauble was back. And this time, the grin was unmistakably wider, its painted eyes gleaming with something almost alive. I inched closer, unable to tear my eyes away. As I stared at it, the air seemed to grow colder, and a faint sound reached my ears. It was a raspy, low whisper, "Merry Christmas." My phone slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor. The sound snapped me out of my daze, and I bolted back to my bedroom, slamming the door shut behind me. I tried to convince myself it was a bad dream, a hallucination. But as I lay there, trembling under the covers, I heard the faint jingle of ornaments clinking against each other. The next morning, I hesitated before going into the living room. Sunlight poured through the windows, banishing the shadows from the night before. The ornament was gone from the mantel. The shattered pieces on the floor had disappeared. But every other ornament on the tree had been turned to face outward, all their painted eyes staring directly at me. I packed the ornament away in a box that morning and shoved it in the attic. I haven't opened it since. But every Christmas Eve, without fail, I hear a faint whisper, "Merry Christmas." Last year, I spent Christmas alone in my apartment. It wasn't my first choice, but after a rough breakup and a falling out with my family, I wasn't in the mood for gatherings. I'd planned a quiet evening with a bottle of wine and some old holiday movies, but the night turned out to be anything but peaceful. It was close to midnight when I first heard the singing. It started faint, almost imperceptible over the sound of the TV. A soft, slow rendition of Silent Night. At first, I thought it was coming from a neighbor's apartment, but as I turned the volume down, I realized it wasn't. It was outside, drifting up from the street below. Curious, I went to the window and peeked out. The street was empty. Snow fell gently under the glow of the streetlights, but there were no carolers, no people at all. The singing grew louder, though, as if it was moving closer. I stepped back from the window, an uneasy feeling creeping over me. It wasn't just the song itself. It was the way it was sung. Slow, deliberate. Each note stretched out in a way that felt wrong. I locked the door and tried to brush it off, but the unease lingered. Then came the knock. 3 soft, deliberate taps that echoed in the silence. My stomach dropped. "Who's there?" I called out. My voice shaky. There was no response. Just silence. And then another knock. I crept to the peephole, heart hammering. Through it, I saw a woman standing in the hallway. She was wearing an old-fashioned dress, something straight out of a Victorian portrait. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were sunken. She stared straight ahead, her lips moving silently as if she was still singing. I stumbled back, unsure what to do. My phone was in the other room, and the thought of opening the door was out of the question. I tried to steady my breathing, but the song started again. This time, it wasn't coming from outside, it was inside, echoing softly through my living room. I turned slowly, and there she was. The woman stood in the corner of the room, her mouth moving in that slow, haunting tune. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I felt frozen, unable to move or even scream. She began to walk toward me, her steps slow and deliberate. The closer she got, the colder the air became, until I could see my breath misting in front of me. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out. The room was plunged into darkness, and the singing stopped. When the lights came back on, she was gone. But on the coffee table in front of me was a single piece of paper, aged and yellowed. Written on it in spidery handwriting were the words, "You sang beautifully. Until next year." This Christmas, I'm not staying home alone.